Welcome to the Paramedic AF Show with your hosts, Dan and Michelle. We hope you've come prepared to be challenged, offended, and encouraged. We are here to create a better future for the entire EMS industry. We have changed or omitted names of individuals in order to protect the innocent, the guilty, and the incompetent. We believe that knowledge fuels power, ignorance is not bliss, and nothing will change until we abandon the status quo. This is our design. Welcome to the show. And welcome back to the Paramedic AF Show. I'm Daniel.
And I'm Michelle.
And today we are going to be talking about conflict management. Now, our theme last month was going over the core values of EMS 2.0 and kind of laying out what we, want and hope to achieve for developing and changing this field. This month we want to talk more about communication, interpersonal relationships within the field, kind of delve into the stuff that we really don't talk about much, or at least we don't have a good system for approaching it. And conflict especially is a good place to start because we all experience conflict in every aspect of our lives, and in this job especially, with all of us very dominant people, I feel like we're very prone to it. So this is a very, very important topic for us to unpack and kind of lay out a good pathway forward.
I think it's funny that you bring up conflict in every aspect of life because the first thing that comes to mind is children. Children are some very, especially the toddlers, are very aggressive little, conflicting children. They're angry.
They have no problem expressing their desires.
No. So, I guess you can try and apply some of the stuff today to your children, but please don't fist fight a toddler. We're not encouraging that.
Not directly.
Listen. Anyways, so with conflict management as applicable to EMS, the two main,
heads.
Yes, heads of a hydra.
The knobs.
Stop. That we tend to see in EMS are between us and patients or bystanders, like on a call, and then between us and coworkers, or like us and various levels of command. So just like you can lead up, you can lead down, same with conflict. It can be lateral amongst ourselves, it could be lateral amongst us and, fire, police, or up or down with leadership.
Well, and it's important to understand the psychology of conflict as we approach this and realize that, there's a lot of applications that are transferable from physical combat and war, both that we can learn in leadership like we've talked about before, but also in actual conflict resolution and the stages of conflict, the reasons for it. There's a lot of lessons we can learn from the past, from our current conflicts, and so on and so forth. No, this isn't going to be a history lesson, that's just something to bear in mind as we're going through this. So there's a lot of reasons that conflict can occur, but I've kind of, in my own brain, nailed it down to three primary categories of reasons for conflict. The first would be power shift conflict, and that's where someone is either attempting to exert power over a situation or people, or they're attempting to regain power that they have lost, either that they have actually lost or that they just think they have lost.
I feel like a good example of this is when you get into dick measuring contests, either amongst a partnership or fire compared to EMS, same or, certs and everything else. Is that kind of what you're...
Yeah, it can happen. It can happen on scenes with patients too, because there's a lot of people who think that they have to walk in the room and be, the biggest dick in the room. And that's not the case. Your job isn't to come in and be like, I'm the mighty emperor in this situation. Like, no, that's not the way you deal with this.
Okay. And when you have the patients, or more so the family members that are either nurses or, as we've all seen, CNAs that think they know more than EMS, then it just turns into a hot mess. We can all think of that patient family member that we've come across.
Yes, and yes, you do need to maintain control over a scene, but there's ways to do it without creating extra conflict. That doesn't mean that you'll never have conflict. It doesn't mean that you won't have to kind of flex a little bit, but that's kind of a last resort. But yes, that's an example of a power shift conflict, whether it's a family member or a provider trying to insert their authority in a scene where it's not appropriate or doesn't need to be there in that way right then. The second category of reasons for conflict is kind of just a grouping of miscommunications and assumptions. So it's where one or several people interpret an action or set of actions, and rather than attempting to understand the reasons behind those actions or set of actions, they immediately assume intent and react in response to that intent, to that perceived intent. So you do something, you did it, from a very particular point of view with a very particular reasoning. Someone else interprets it as a completely different intent and reasoning, and they just treat you as if that's actually what happened, rather than trying to figure out, okay, what were you really thinking? What was your point behind this? The third category, and I think this is something we can all say we have seen, is chaos conflict. It's where people are creating conflict simply for the hell of it. There's no reason, there's no benefit, they just want to fucking fight. Again, I've seen this with providers. I've seen this with fellow responders. I've seen it with patients and with family members. It happens all the time. We can't control what other entities do. But for us, as providers and professionals, when we're managing a scene, or if we're at work, period, your goal should not be creating chaos. What you do in your spare time, more power to you. Don't really give a fuck. But when you're at work, functioning in our community, in our team, this is just unacceptable. There's no situation where chaos conflict is appropriate, period, in a workplace, and especially in our workplace.
Well, and with the miscommunication and assumptions, I think we referred to this in a separate episode. Like, the running joke is assumption means making an ass out of you and I, because there's something misconstrued, especially because, as we learned in school, I'm sure we've all repeated back to students, new providers, etc., that no two providers are going to run the same call the same way every single time. There's always going to be a change. And the difference in mindset, the difference in attitude, the difference the way we speak to each other is also going to play into that.
And like you said, we've unpacked some of this, and we will talk about it more, how ego plays into this, and assumptions, and taking things personally. And there's a maturing process that, it sounds easy enough to say, well, I don't take shit personally. Yeah, we all kind of fucking do.
Everybody does.
And that often is a source of conflict, and that fuels a lot of the miscommunication and assumptions conflicts, and creates problems that just don't need to be there. So, with the context of those primary reasons for conflict, there's a concept that I learned. No, I am not a professional fighter or anything, but I have spent some time actually studying martial arts, and one of my favorite forays into that was studying what was called Jeet Kune Do, and it's basically a form of Chinese boxing and kung fu that was created by Bruce Lee when he came to the States. And it was a highly simplified, down and dirty, engage the enemy, neutralize the threat, and leave. And a concept that we were taught in that was what's called a fighting measure. So if you think about this in a physical sense, there's a radius. If you just draw a line around you, it's almost like your personal bubble in a way. It's quite literally how far out your arms can reach, and a little bit beyond. That's your fighting measure. So if someone either brings their full body or an extremity into that space, that's called entering your fighting measure. And so at that point, that you have to determine, okay, is this person a threat or not? Obviously, a loved one, family member, child, or whatever is going to come into your space all the time, and they mean you no harm. But when someone strange or not, someone that you're not intimately familiar with, enters that fighting measure immediately there's a problem. If you're on a call and someone just out of nowhere just comes right up into your space, that's going to trigger some defense mechanisms. And you need to, step back, maintain that space, push away. And if they continue to present as a threat, then you need to deal with that threat, neutralize that threat, and maintain that space between you. So it's important because you need to realize that everybody has that line, whether they are consciously aware of it or not. And if you're going to enter that space, you need to be prepared for a fight, either verbally or physically, because if you're coming into that with aggression, it doesn't matter who's right or wrong, you're going to instigate a fight.
I don't mean to fully sidestep. This is applicable here, but you talking about this actually has an interesting application to some of what we talked about last week with mental health, talking about triggers and personal space. So, like, if you have somebody that maybe, and this can be applicable at work or like even in your home personal life with, trauma, triggers, PTSD, all of the things, anxiety, that let's say you have somebody that's normally like a loving, huggy, touchy-feely person, but when they get triggered and maybe they're falling back on that polyvagal theory, that we talked about last week, and somebody enters into their space, we need to be mindful of the reality of not only the person entering, whether it's a child, it's a loved one, I mean, pet. If you punch your pet, I mean, we're gonna fight. But
But I've seen that happen. I've seen
yes.
people who would deal with PTSD who have their dog like pushed them over that edge, and it sucks and it's awful and I hate it and it still makes me mad. But like, that's tough. That sucks.
Oh, I know, but it's still entering into that and understanding that, like, the body falling back on that polyvagal theory, triggering that defense mechanism. Yes, I am not knocking on anybody that is triggered. I mean, I still have triggers, all the rest of it, but being mindful not only of ourselves, but of other people, whether we're entering into their circle because they're going through a really hard time, if this is on a call, or whether someone else, like a child, is entering into our bubble when triggered at home, for example. Yeah. I'm sorry to sidestep into the mental health, just this is a very interesting application to mental health that we didn't talk about, that I guess I didn't think of like that process last week.
Yeah, and really when it comes to, obviously in a physical setting, from a physical threat standpoint, the fighting measure is a very simple, straightforward concept. It's, you are entering the space where you can actually do some damage to me. And when it comes to conflict resolution and drawing these personal lines, and you kind of get more into the psychological areas, it's important that everybody draws their lines distinctly. And it's going to be a little bit different for each person. One of my lines is, if I fucked up, cool. You can challenge me on it, call me out all day long. If you are going to call me a liar, you are crossing into my space. If you're gonna call me an outright liar, in a professional sense or whatever, I'm gonna take you to the fucking cleaners. Like, you better be prepared to back it up, because that's not gonna go well for you. Also, if you're threatening my livelihood for no reason, if you're trying to potentially endanger my job, that's not going to end well for you. That's a line of my personal barrier. And there's no title that gives you a right to cross into that fighting measure unchallenged. It doesn't matter. You could be the top dog director of a huge service, and if you come at me the wrong way, sorry, you're just as responsible for watching how you approach me as someone who's technically my peer. So it's not a matter of being out looking for fights. It's, you need to realize that everybody has a line, and everybody's lines deserve respect. There are healthy boundaries that need to be drawn. So as we're delving into conflict, it's important to think about, okay, how can I resolve this disagreement, weird situation, whatever you call it, without crossing into someone's fighting measure?
I think that has kind of an interesting application. With a new cohort of students a couple weeks ago, we actually talked about like our affect and, instigating agitated patients and all the rest of it. And really, when it comes down to conflict and even our jobs, we have to profile. Like, I know profiling has like, a negative connotation, cops pulling over, said person because of, said profiling, whatever. But I mean, we kind of do. We have to read the room. We have to look at, where patients are, how they're acting, their environment, all the rest of it. Well, you have to profile a patient's or family member's behavior. There are some patients where, gently touching their arm may de escalate, may be okay. Like, for example, I know I keep going back to cardiac arrest. Well, like if you have to deliver a death notification, there's some family members that would take, would accept you entering their bubble, gently touching their arm, genuinely, I'm so sorry for your loss, all the rest of it. Whereas you're going to have other family members, they're going to fly through, the 5 stages of grief at some point or another, and anger is one of them, where entering even within, 5 feet of that person when delivering news is not going to be good. Not that you have instigated their aggression, but you need to keep that profiling and space in mind. There are times some people may be open to you entering a little bit closer, and then there are other times you may need to actually back up even further out of their perceived, I guess, arm's reach.
Yeah, they're figurative arm's reach.
Yes.
And that comes into, ultimately, you need to decide, am I ready to create conflict, and is escalating conflict necessary? So the first stage of delving into that is, well, how do we define what's healthy conflict versus unhealthy conflict?
So when comparing the two, healthy conflict has a beneficial purpose or outcome. No matter whether you have EMT, paramedic, EMT, EMT, paramedic, paramedic, critical care, just some kind of combination, it's how it is handled throughout the quote unquote conflict. And the way I think about healthy conflict is more like professional disagreement, or like, instead of doing ABC, I want to do, not like ABCs like airway, breathing, circulation, but like, I want to do intervention ABC, but maybe the other person wants to do CBA. It's is having this agreement or something else, like, are we looking for a good outcome? The healthy conflict has to be depersonalized. You have to, did I say healthy outcome? I meant healthy conflict. I'm sorry. All the words are flying in my head. Healthy conflict needs to be more depersonalized. Don't take things personally. Don't assume things. Be straightforward. What word am I looking for?
Well, and it's not to say that there aren't times where you need to stick up for yourself, because there is a personal element to it, but more of, hey, we're going to stay at that arm's reach from each other to find a resolution to this without entering each other's space and causing a personal conflict, and looking for what's the best way to get through this conflict to a good outcome.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I was looking for a word and now it has escaped me, so it's probably just lost in the abyss.
Fly away.
But it really is. It's lost in the abyss. But anyways,
Right there with my last flying fuck. They're gone.
they're
Just a side note. There's a friend of mine. I think you might know him, but he has a card that he keeps, a laminated card that he keeps in his wallet, and it says fuck on it, and he says that is his last fuck. And when it's time to pull out that card and throw it down on the ground, that is truly his last fuck to give.
I sort of kind of want to do that just for shits and giggles.
I mean, yes. Anyway, sidestep.
Yes, sorry.
So healthy conflict.
Yes. It's focusing on the healthy outcome. Now, to go the other direction, the unhealthy conflict is very much self-centered. I feel like it's where ego runs away from you, is controlling everything. It's a dick measuring contest. It's sticking to your guns and not accepting that there could be another way or another resolution or something like that. The conflict doesn't care about any collateral damage, whether you're going to hurt somebody else, hurt the patient. And this is definitely more to the extreme. I'm not saying every single unhealthy conflict is going to hurt a patient, but especially with coworkers or management, there's some kind of collateral damage because you just have to stick to your guns and it's a dick measuring contest. The end goal is either vindication or dominance over, whatever the outcome is that you're wanting. Now, while looking at all this, we've kind of come up with a sequence of conflict, like how this comes to be.
So it's hard to explain this without like drawing out a picture, but there's kind of 7 steps of conflict. I'm going to start with the second step. The second step is whatever the event is. So, whatever you did or someone else did or something, the sentinel event that has now started this cascade. So, step two in the sequence, is the event. Step 3 is the reaction. So, you've done something and the other person involved in this conflict reacts a particular way to it. That can be good, it can be bad, it can be any number of things. The 4th step is where there's a challenge, where that person has a reaction and they come back and they challenge you, saying, hey, you did this, blah, 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 blah. And at this point, things can go one of 2 ways. If it's a mature situation, that person can be like, hey, this is what happened, this is what I saw, this is how I felt about it. Were you meaning for this to be perceived this way? So that actually points back to step 1 of the sequence, is the underlying reason for the event. I did X because of Y. I know that, but I might not have communicated that, or it may not be self-evident. So a person who is reacting to what I did, they're challenging it, they should be trying to find out, hey, what's the reason? Why'd you do this? Because, and the next step would be rebuttals. So step 5, rebuttals. You challenge me because of something I did that you perceived a certain way. I get to come back and explain, hey, this is what I meant. This is what my underlying reason was. So then step 7 becomes either understanding, where the person says, oh, okay, that makes sense. I didn't realize that. Cool, we're good. Or they continue to embrace their assumptions and say, well, no, you actually meant this and this and this and da-da-da-da-da. And that creates this loop that we get stuck in. And the unhealthy conflict can just perpetuate itself and has to be resolved either from an external source, or it's not an adequate resolution and one or both parties lose in that situation.
Daniel had a verbal stroke. Step 7 is resolution, not assumptions.
I meant step 6. Sorry.
That's okay.
So let me just read it through one more time. So step 1 of the sequence of conflict, there's a reason for an event. Step 2 is the event itself actually takes place. Step 3, there's a reaction from other people to that event. Step 4, those other people, or just an individual, present a challenge. Step 5, there's a rebuttal. You get to explain yourself, what have you. You should be given the opportunity to explain yourself. There's a lot of people that their challenge, they just skip to the resolution. But ideally, you get a rebuttal. Step 6 is they either give some understanding to you, or they perpetuate their negative assumptions. Step 7 is resolution. So ideally, what should be happening is this is especially crucial when you do have a negative reaction to something, is let's go find out why that happened. Because often it's very easy for us to justify actions in our heads the actions themselves may be good, bad, neutral, any number of things. But if our reasoning is not self-evident, then we need to be prepared to explain it. But the people who are challenging also need to be prepared to hear what was the reasoning and to accept that reasoning. Now, another mistake that happens here is in the challenge phase. If your challenge is, hey friend, here's what happened, here's what I saw, here's what I felt, I see this as a problem, can we work on this? At that point, you have announced yourself. You have entered into this conflict in a healthy way and established some boundaries. But if you come in immediately and step into, let's say I'm the one who did whatever the thing is. If you immediately jump into my space, immediately jump into throwing accusations, pointing fingers, running with those assumptions, and not allowing there to be some rebuttal, to be some explanation, to provide some understanding, then suddenly this has escalated pretty significantly, and it can't not be personal, because at that point you are truly stepping in and becoming a threat of sorts.
It's not just how suddenly they come into your space, it's also tone. Because,
Yes.
like, there are some high strung people, and I don't say that in a bad way, like, high strung, high energy, they're going to step, like, maybe too close, maybe be, like, talking very loud, very fast, all the rest of it. But, like, tone can also be very telling. Like, if you run a really bad call and something got messed up, and we're talking like this, and we really need to talk about this because I'm really worried about the patient conflict.
Hmm.
That's not necessarily like I'm coming at you, but like if you have a
No.
really nasty tone, like you fuck this up, and this and
Yeah.
that, like that can also change it. Not just energy, but tone, also words.
Yes. And this is conflict that can happen over text message. It actually is easier for it to happen over text message because there's no tone to read.
It's
It's
your personal perceived tone.
exactly, which creates a whole nother sequence of conflict and puts us in all these other little loops that are just a pain in the ass.
Listen, Linda.
But it's true. And so in the context of, we're talking about in the context of our profession specifically, you know, we do this to ourselves as much as we do it to patients. And, okay, yes, it's very easy to look at a frequent flyer and be like, bro, what the fuck? And we basically can create this conflict subtly and start challenging them and making these even implicit personal accusations against them. And if we don't give them any room to speak, then suddenly this is going to become an unhealthy conflict and it's going to cause problems. You're going to get a complaint filed against you, what the fuck ever. Now, just because you get a complaint filed against you doesn't mean that, you were automatically in the wrong. Just you're going to get one filed. So you better be prepared to back up what you did. But this sequence is important for people to understand, and that they need to realize that the ideal path is to flow through all 7 steps sequentially. You had a reason for doing something. You did that thing. Someone reacted to it. They challenged you. You explained it. They understood. They acknowledged. Or you had to be schooled and you accept responsibility and say, hey, I fucked up. I'm sorry. Let's move past this. And you go to resolution. That's a beautiful, smooth flow of conflict. It didn't turn into anything bad and it had a positive outcome. So we need to be more aware of that and aware of our own, how we enter into those discussions, because we can step into someone's fighting space, make it a thing, and shit hits the fan, and suddenly we're in HR.
Well, and what resolution looks like is going to change depending on parties involved, what the event was,
Yes.
whether you need your, corrective investment, didactic investment, all of the things. The resolution is going to look different, but it's the process of being able to healthily move through all of the steps to find something so everyone is, I don't want to say safe and happy, but everyone is safe and there's some general understanding. So it ideally doesn't repeat in the future.
And it's ultimately where everybody's needs are met. Your professional need to provide care and do it in an effective way, or to address a problem with your coworker while still, meeting them where they're at, understanding where they're coming from, and all of that. It's a win-win all around if you do it appropriately. If you're willing to be proven wrong, as another big one. But let's kind of dig into how this affects patient conflict specifically.
So, conflict with patients and bystanders is inevitable. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to happen on every single call. There are some calls where, maybe the patient is worked up, but family is fine, or family's worked up and the patient is fine. There's all kinds of combinations, and sometimes everybody's chill. Sometimes, even the patient knows it's bullshit, but they just want to ride to the hospital for whatever. But it can happen to the patient or family during, either a true emergency or a perceived emergency, those people on scene are on high alert, and they're more likely to cross into, as Daniel calls it, or learned, the your fighting measure. Especially this can happen if there's like a long response time or even long dispatch time, depending on the status of the county. If, for example, you get the patient into the ambulance and you're sitting on scene starting interventions, you know, usually on that front, family's going to get a little bit more worked up, but it can happen. People are on high alert. And the important thing is for us to not start getting worked up, matching their energy, then they're going to worked up more. It's almost like an energy, like, showdown, show off, like, one upping. There we go. One upping energies. You know, we have to respect everyone's boundaries, but we have to gain and maintain control of the scene. Sometimes you have to step up the intensity of, I guess you could say, conflict. There are times when you have to show, I don't want to say force, but like dominance.
You have to flex a little bit.
Well, I mean, there are plenty of times, we were talking to students about this a couple weeks ago. Like, sometimes it may require you and your partner to play like the good cop, bad cop. You know, you should always approach a patient with kindness, even killed tone, all the rest of it. But like, if that's not working, it may require you taking like a deeper, more forceful, like, we are not behaving like this. Let's have a conversation. Now, obviously, I would say it with more inflection, but like, I don't want to be screaming into the microphone at you guys. But sometimes that does require, you know, speaking louder or changing your tone or
Changing your posture.
changing your posture. Just like, you know, with paranoid psych patients, you know, sometimes, you know, having closed fists, even if you're not like showing a form of aggression, crossing your arms can be seen as either defensive or, you know, aggravating, that can escalate it. You have to, I guess we can fall back on profile and see what is going to be appropriate, because there are times you have to, I wouldn't say escalate, but you have to try and take control of it. You have to do it carefully. You have to have level head when you're doing it. And sometimes that is required to maintain security on a scene. But if it gets to a point where you have to start a fight, whether it's, or you wouldn't be starting a physical fight, I would hope. But, you know, something has escalated up. You have to have a good reason and be willing to back it up. I mean, even in court, if something bad happens, you know.
It's easy for us to have a default combative posture. And I think that's something that we get wrong a lot of times. And it's very easy to do. I've been there. I've been that guy before. And really, it is so important to attempt to do a de-escalation first, if at all possible. It's not always going to be possible. But most conflicts on scene can be avoided or resolved by keeping your cool, showing respect and empathy to the patient, family members at the scene, other responders who may be becoming emotionally involved in this situation, whatever the case may be. Keeping a low, genuine, clear tone, speaking with a positive pitch, can often drop the patient and family's hyper-defensive posture and allow them to feel safe enough to cooperate with you. If you project, instead of dominance, if you project a almost like a comforting strength, like, hey, I'm good, I'm not fazed by this, let's work through this together. So many times that is all you need to do, is just provide that comforting reassurance that, hey, I'm good, I'm in charge, I'm not fazed by this. And there's absolutely no glory in being that asshole that creates fights where they don't need to be. And y'all know who you are. It's stupid. Don't do this. Don't be that guy that just comes in and talks to people like they're fucking dogs. If they're yelling at you and cussing at you and screaming at you and you're not able to, you know, effectively get away from the situation, or you still have to be there, that's one thing. It's got to ramp up, cool. But don't come in to 80-year-old grandma who, okay, maybe she's taking an extra 10 minutes to tell you her life story as part of the history of the chief complaint. Don't be that asshole that just comes in and starts a fight with her. Like, this is ridiculous. This shouldn't even have to be a discussion.
I mean, if we're being honest, not that you should come into it, but like little old Grams are mean and they're kind of strong. Like,
They can be. And listen, there's some of them that feisty and they like it. They like it when you
yes,
come in and be like, "Honey, you ain't gonna talk to me like that." Like, and listen, I enjoy a good fight as much as anybody. Like that, honestly, it's fun. It's cathartic. It's great.
it makes Daniel mad that I've had more violent psych patients that have required sedation in the past 6 months than he has in forever.
It really does. But that being said, it is getting to the point where you truly have to escalate, like significantly escalate, should only be after you have tried to utilize some peaceful routes first.
Now, if someone is verbally or truly physically threatening you, or related to what we were just talking about, profiling, reading the room, and something is going bad, or they make a genuine verbal or physical like gesture, you have to do something about it. We've always taught providers, try not to let, a bad situation, somebody get between you and the exit. Have an ingress egress.
Have ideally 2 points of egress if you can.
Yes. Now with some of the houses we're in, it's difficult getting in or
Ingress
out
is
one
hard
way.
enough.
Yes. Ideally, you need to remove yourself from the situation. Provider safety first. But if for whatever reason that is not possible, do what is necessary. Now, this may sound cruel, discompassionate. We're not, telling you to, incite violence, but the reality of the job is it can be very dangerous, very quick, and sometimes there is no like true slow ramping up escalation. Not to be hateful, but especially with psych patients or suicidal patients that genuinely mean harm to themselves. It can go from completely fine to completely not fine. We're not going into these people's houses with firearms or bulletproof vests. For the most part, we're not getting any kind of combat training, whether it's, the very basic self-defense for confined spaces or first responder type thing. We just don't know. One brief example, I was called out to, I believe his dispatch is an overdose. Get there, guy had taken like I think 2 extra Klonopin. He wasn't like completely intoxicated, dangerous, blah blah blah. Law enforcement and fire had already been on scene. Law enforcement checked the house. The knives had been like moved out of the way. They checked for guns and all of his drawers in his dresser and all the rest of it. I'm sitting in the kitchen talking to him. He's crying, talking about like his baby mama won't see his child. This was on Father's Day several years ago. But, he was crying, very upset. And all of a sudden he stopped crying, jumped up and kind of walked towards the back of the house. Well, law enforcement had already checked it. And part of this is, my fault as a provider not paying attention to his change in behavior. But he went from, a very sad father, it was a rough day, just having a mental breakdown, popped up, went to the back. I could hear him crying. So I walked back and the cop was right behind me. Well, he was in one of those tiny mill homes that like the doorway was truly like shoulder width. And I stepped into his room and his back was to me. He was crying. When he turned around, he was holding a gun, pointed at me and said, "You're not going to keep me from killing myself." Well, that went from 0 to a million in a hot ass second, and law enforcement had supposedly already checked the house. But what had happened, dude man slept with a gun under his mattress, not his pillow, his mattress. So, I yell gun. I try and, egress back out the way I can. Well, the house was so small and that was in a hallway. The cop actually shoved me forward further into the room to the patient to like get around me before I could back up. So we're not prepared for that. And sometimes things can escalate even with law enforcement on scene. Now, looking back, I should have seen more of his change in behavior and maybe let the cop go in first and herd him back up front. So that's a lesson for me to learn. But like, we need to be careful.
Well, and it's not cool to go in without law enforcement. If you're told to stage, fucking stage. I don't care there's no call that's worth you risking your life for no reason. There's nothing, you're not gonna get hurt waiting an extra 10 minutes if that's what it takes. And I've had to wait 30 minutes before for law enforcement because they get busy too. But guys, stop! Don't go in as trying to be heroes. You don't have a gun. Well, at least you're not supposed to. Most of us don't have vests. Most of y'all don't have any kind of combat training. Don't go in. If it's a potentially dangerous scene, you wait for law enforcement. Now, in this entire discussion, we have to throw in the caveat. We are not, let me repeat, we are not offering you legal advice. Your first priority in a dangerous situation should be to remove yourself first and then others from the dangerous scene. You need to know your state / county, country's laws regarding self-defense and first responders. Now, I will say this. I would much rather lose my job or go to jail than be buried 6 feet under. But that choice is yours. But you need to be aware. You need to be conscious. You need to not go in, trying to be a hero and do something stupid that's going to put you in a casket.
At the end of the day, you have to keep yourself safe. If you end up getting hurt, we're all taught this in school. If you get hurt, you're just adding another patient to the situation, potentially, endangering others or whatever, and you might not go home to your family. You have to put yourself first, but we also need to do what's right for our patients. Not that they should come over you. Like, that's two things hand in hand. It's a crazy world, and I mean, that switch can be flipped in a hot ass second. So even if the scene is perceived as safe, even like with my example, law enforcement's on scene, you still need to keep your head on a swivel. You still need to pay attention. Scene safety should be an assessment that you're doing throughout the entire call, especially as more people show up on scene. You should expect the worst, not like in a paranoid sense, but just be prepared. Plan for the exotic, the crazy things, sight, smells, all the things that we see, but hope for the best. Not everybody, in the world is horrific, but know that there are those, bad, ill-intentioned people out there.
Because you can't make up the shit that we see and run into. Like, this ain't like the movies.
No, and like every time as we're talking, it reminds me of like various calls that I'm just like, did that really happen? Like, did I see that? Like, really? But I'm sure there's so much more that we can talk about, especially with, the patient situations, houses, safety for everybody on calls. But that's kind of the gist of what we're wanting to get at with the patient bystander conflict. Now, obviously, it gets complicated on an arrest or, bad call or something where more and more...
She does run more kinds of calls in cardiac arrests. Just
I swear I do, but that's a good example, though. It's a good example where everybody's worked up, especially providers haven't run it very often. You have a ton of providers on that call. Depending on who called it in, more and more family comes in. You're usually working with law enforcement and fire. It's kind of a good example call. But anyways, I'm sorry. We totally sidestepped. I have run so many of the calls in medical conditions, but that's a good example. Anyways, so we've kind of covered that. Let's kind of move into like conflict with coworkers / like chain of command, up or down, depending on what your position is.
So this section is a little bit more volatile and really political, but it still needs to be talked about. The conflicts that arise between coworkers and the chain of command are a very regular thing and is something that, I personally have had to grow in over the years because there's been a lot of them I feel like I handled very well and I have no regrets. And there's some times where it's like, I could have handled that a lot differently. Even if, the net result was still the same, would have still been the same, I could have approached it differently. But unfortunately in our industry, we just don't do a good job on the whole of handling internal conflict. Few places actually have a true pathway established for handling these interpersonal conflicts. It's pretty much a short walk from a verbal warning to termination with a lot of gray areas in between. And there's no consistency on how that escalates. Like, you know, everything could be, fine, honky dory, and all of a sudden, boom, a supervisor is jumping down your throat about something and then escalating it further up the chain of management. And we're like, well, wait a minute, we hadn't even talked about this. Like, there's a couple of steps we just skipped dealing with this. And there's a significant amount of power abuse that occurs in this context of, both coworker and chain of command conflict. The older providers who are railroading newbies and treating them like absolute shit and jumping down their throats over every little damn thing. Or whether it's supervisors who are flexing their authority excessively to someone who is either legitimately or illegitimately challenging them. And, this is something that we all witness daily. And, even if someone's not legitimately challenging you, you don't need to default to, let me flex my muscles at you, my authority, my authority. Like, we don't need to go there. That's not what the first jump should be. As a supervisor, you should be, well, I mean, not just a supervisor, anyone, you should have at least some level of agreeableness and allow benefit of the doubt before escalating these conflicts.
So the first one that we're going to kind of touch on is going to be our peer-to-peer conflict. I don't want to say ideally this is one that we prefer to deal with, because nobody wants to deal with conflict, but this is one that we frequently see. There are so many personalities and stuff within the field. Inevitably, with someone, or many someones, depending on the situation, you're going to have some kind of conflict. And the first thing that we need to deal with is face-to-face communication. Just like we talked about, tone can be misconstrued in any kind of text, handwritten note for those of us that are old school and pass notes in school, and email and all the rest of it. Now, there are going to be many times that a paper form or, quote unquote, paper trail or digital footprint is required, like writing up a situation in order for management or whoever, however it's going to escalate, needs, in case action does need to be taken more. But if you have conflict with, let's say, a partner, someone in our peer group, coworker, etc., you have to talk about it in person. If it's not talked about, it's going to marinate. There's no substitute for communicating in person. It leaves no room for assumptions. And sometimes it's enough. I don't want to say all the time. I don't want to say 50-50, but sometimes it's enough to end the dispute.
There's a difference between, what is ethically / legally necessary as far as a paper trail and what's going to actually bring the resolution. Because there are some conflicts, there are certain things, whether it's you responding to an accusation made or you are addressing a problem directly, there may be a time where written communication is your first order of business, just as a level of protection. But from the perspective of, hey, we want to bring resolution to this quickly and we don't need to escalate this to become a thing, then that face-to-face communication is absolute king. And when we think about this in terms, too, of entering that fighting measure, assumptions escalate conflict very, very quickly. And it's important to, when you're confronting someone, like we talked about earlier, signal who you are, what you're doing. Make your case, allow for explanations, some discourse, some conversation, and only go into that fighting space, that fighting measure, when it's absolutely necessary. You do always need to be willing to be wrong. You need to acknowledge your own limited perspective, allow the other person room to clarify, and because once you enter that fighting measure, me personally, again, talking about in the terms of physical combat, the rule was someone enters your fighting measure, you do the fastest, most appropriate, most definitive thing to get them out of that space. And if I can't back away from you, then I'm going to try and neutralize your threat as quickly as possible. So if you're not doing this face to face, it's very easy for things to get to that point where we're battling it out just because.
Which leads into, if you come peacefully with somebody, ideally we're going to, I guess, energy match. If I come calmly to you and say, hey, I need to talk about this, in, I don't even want to say a perfect world, just we need to start working on ourselves and working with our communication to be able to come to the person to be like, of course I'll listen to you. Like, let's talk about this. Some feelings might get hurt, but we need to, talk back and forth. Now, if you come peacefully to somebody and they reject it, they get defensive, they start attacking you, then, I mean, obviously to an extent, things are going to escalate. But you yourself need to keep in mind, only escalate as necessary. And when you escalate, you have to be certain, you have to be definitive. And if it gets to whether it's verbal or physical, don't be timid. Like, if you're going to go there, you need to commit.
Well, and tone is a huge thing here, because you can be definitive, you can be assertive, you can even be somewhat aggressive without being inflammatory. And again, there's times where inflammatory language unfortunately becomes necessary, but there should be a sense of, all right, you crossed into my fighting measure, cool, back off, here's the way things are, this is what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. You either respect that boundary and back up, or we're going to have a problem. Now, literally what I just said there was not anything inflammatory. I didn't accuse you of anything. I didn't say, you're this, you're that, whatever. It was not a personal attack. It was, hey, you need to step away. You need to check your tone, because this is going to get out of hand if you don't. So that tone is very important, because if you come at someone with the wrong tone, you're going to skip past the ability to be able to understand them. That tone is going to ruin something that understanding would be able to accept. So even just in peer-to-peer conflict, it's crucial to again keep that posture of de-escalation, stay out of the fighting measure, but when you got to, jump into it, finish the conflict, and be done with it.
I will say on that front, I'm usually better at controlling my tone than controlling my face.
That's why sometimes I guess text messages can be nice, or at least a phone call.
Yeah, I didn't think about the phone call. Now, face-to-face is still preferred, but just keep in mind when checking your tone that sometimes we need to put more effort into relaxing our facial muscles.
Well, and here's the other thing, too, is most people are keyboard warriors. They will call you all kinds of things. They'll complain about all kinds of things. But when you actually come and say, like, hey, let's talk about this, suddenly it's, oh, I didn't mean that, or I didn't mean this, or whatever. Like, most people don't have the balls to handle the face-to-face conflict. And if you are that person who will go and confront people and be like, hey, I saw what you said about, I read what you sent me, or, hey, I have a problem with what you just said or what you just did. A lot of people don't have the backbone to actually back it up. And I'm not meaning to be condescending there. It's just a reality of the culture we live in right now, where we have the technology that allows us to get away with talking a certain way. When I was a kid, if you talked to somebody like that, you was going to get punched in the face.
Well, you see that a lot with social media.
Oh, yeah. And it's translated into our workplace, because God, when we go to work, it's like stepping back into high school. And I was a homeschooler, so that's pretty sad, me saying that. Like, I kind of almost wish that there was a certain level of, like, at work combat that was okay. Like, I can't remember if it was the Greeks or the Romans, that when they would have disagreements in the Senate, like the two representatives that actually had the disagreement needed to literally strip down naked and wrestle in front of everybody to solve the disagreement. Like,
so
I'm not advocating naked wrestling at
work. I was
work.
saying I'm not doing that, but
some of y'all gross. Need to wash more.
Well, getting to, like, fight either a patient or coworker like once a shift, like, okay, like that's one thing, but nakedness, no. I got enough of that last week thinking about providers being naked squatting in the shower.
Yeah. Well, and no, we're not advocating workplace violence. Just saying that there's so many times where people are willing to have a big mouth but not actually back it up. So the doing more face-to-face communication is actually going to neutralize a lot of those problems and actually bring down the tone a little bit, because we all have to look each other in the eye to deal with this. This translates to dealing with chain of command as well.
Now, this is going to be a little more spicy.
This is a fun topic for me and for everybody.
Oh, goodness. Well, when dealing with this type of conflict, too often wanting to engage to find a resolution, I would be willing to say that most of us, like a high percent, couldn't give you a number, but most of us are afraid of losing our job. I mean, it's a legitimate fear, especially with this day and age, how much we're working and all the rest of it. But losing our job by engaging in conflict with any level of chain of command, or just in general challenging, not even being inflammatory. But the reality is that it, conflict as a whole is impossible to avoid, and inevitably something is going to happen with chain of command, whether it's just, a training officer or, super duper high up. I've seen several times in the news and word of mouth and everything that there have been like high up directors of agencies either stepping down, being forced out, because of this, that, all the rest of it. Like, I mean, no level of provider or chain of command is invincible. Oh God. Invincible.
Sadly, too many of them are invisible and need to become more visible, but separate topic.
Well, yes, but they think can get away with anything without some kind of challenge or conflict. We work in a dynamic environment, and I mean, I think I mentioned it earlier. I mean, this field is full of huge personalities, not even in a bad way. Like, you have to have some level of like alpha dominance leader, like you have to have some kind of big dominant personality to run calls, to deal with the number of people and types of environments we do. So regardless of whether it's fair, whether it's right, if you started it or somebody else did, conflict is inevitably going to happen.
And you can still respect the chain of command without tolerating disrespect or abuse of power. When you're holding leadership accountable to a baseline standard of conduct, you're respecting the office, not necessarily the person. So, again, like we said earlier, just because you have a title doesn't mean that you have permission to step into people's fighting measure with immunity. There is still personal boundaries and respect that need to be in place. And if those boundaries are crossed, then there needs to be a challenge. And just because, you're in the chain of command, you're still accountable by the same standard of conduct as the rest of us. Now, it's important also to flip this back to the team members, the regular providers that aren't in official management positions or whatever. Our job is not convenient. It's not meant to be convenient. And it's important that you pick the battles that are necessary, the ones that matter. There's going to be policies that come out that you don't like. There's going to be changes that you don't like. Okay. And that doesn't, yes, there are times where there's certain policies, certain changes that should be challenged. But just because it's an inconvenience for you, that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. And so keeping that, broader perspective, that humility, and checking your ego a little bit. And, okay, you don't like the fact that you have to do, this new kind of check-off procedure? Tough shit. That's your job. You have to make sure your stuff's there, and it works properly, and you have to verify that. That's your job. Suck it up. Just because it's inconvenient or frustrating, or you don't like it, or it's a change, it doesn't matter, because your personal convenience is not the end goal. You're not being disrespected by a new policy or procedure that ultimately benefits the entire agency. Now, when you're entering into conflict with management, the end goal that you should have, well, really that everyone should have, but if you're the one who's entering into this conflict by choice for whatever reason, the end goal should be the bettering of everyone in the team. It should be preserving the integrity of the relationship between the chain of command and field personnel. That doesn't mean that our personal dignity isn't important. If you're being disrespected, you need to stick up for yourself, but you can do that without obliterating the chain of command. You do need to have a strong, respected, effective chain of command in order to have an effective team. We can't exist without them. This doesn't work as an anarchy. It's not a democracy, but we just like the way our federal government is set up. The governing bodies are supposed to be held accountable by their constituents. This is not an autocratic relationship. And because without the people on the streets, there's nothing to manage. And without management, there's really no order to managing resources to run things on the street.
Now, leaders at various points in the chain of command, especially further up, need to be aware and observe conflict amongst the company as a whole. Too often do we hear, word of mouth, services and people, but services have a reputation of allowing certain things, or they're consistently known for having a consistent problem, or one provider is a consistent problem. And the biggest thing that leadership can do is determine who is the consistent problem. Is it a team member, the provider that is consistently the problem, or if there is a general culture problem that might be flowing downhill from a problematic leader or manager. So your ineffective versus effective leadership. Consistent issues need to be definitively corrected. If you have a leader that is abusing their authority, all that's going to do is scare away good providers, whether from your shift, whether from the system as a whole. We've seen it both ways, and honestly, if we're talking about it, scaring away effective team members from one shift to another shift is just going to play into shift on shift conflict, which
is bullshit.
God, we see it everywhere. I think I would be willing to say that some of the worst that I've seen is when you have a system that has 12s and 24s, or like two different like division areas, and the dick measuring between them, and just the downright hate because, oh, you're on 12s or 24s, or, oh, you work in this area, not mine. Like, that's so stupid.
Well, and ultimately, what your standard is what you're willing to tolerate. So if you're tolerating poor behavior, if you're protecting poor behavior for whatever reason, even if it's just simply because, oh, well, we can't afford to fire anybody, you're going to lower the standard of conduct and expectations for the entire organization, because everyone's going to see, well, okay, this person over here is being, a problem child, causing chaos and doing all these things, not and performing subpar work, and there's no repercussions. They still work here. They're still getting paid the same amount as me. Mm-hmm. That's going to demoralize your people. It's going to corrupt any kind of loyalty that you could possibly build with them, because they see that your performance doesn't actually matter, just that you're present, and that's very discouraging for providers that care about their job. Mm-hmm. And it's gonna perpetuate the problems, because if you don't deal with the problem, it's just like with kids. If you don't, if there's not a consequence for negative behavior, then that's effectively validation of that behavior, and it will be perpetuated.
Mm-hmm. I mean, a problematic team member can poison the entire well.
Just like a problematic leader can poison the entire well as well. Mm-hmm. So it cuts both ways to everybody.
Yes. I mean, I have had a job at some point in my career where I was warned about a particular provider that I would probably at some point get partnered with, and it did happen eventually. Had ongoing problems that reported up the chain of command. They were not surprised to hear about these because it was consistent problems. And it kind of came to a point, Daniel and I have talked about it periodically. Now, it's not a problem anymore, but just in general, this provider had been providing for several years, and everybody that I talked to warned me about said provider. And it just kind of came to a point where I was like, why did I even have to experience this with this provider? Like, why wasn't this handled, 2 years ago? Because, I mean, we're talking multiple years. It's like, I don't understand why this has happened at this point. Now, it could be that the provider or upper management, one or both were the problem, or not problem, but like just when it comes to communication. in resolution. So I guess let me correct, not problem. It requires investment from everybody, from upper management to properly manage conflicts, but also help bring, I don't want to say closure, but a resolution that is going to further the future and not deteriorate, I guess, the overall culture of the system. Like, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So when speaking about these conflicts and how we're going to handle them and stuff, everybody's biggest concern is, what if I get fired?
So it's something I've learned with this over the years, and maybe this is, I guess, I don't know how to word this, without it sounding like, cocky or offensive, but, it is what it is. You can get away with a lot more than you think you can. And and I don't say that from a, justifying bad behavior perspective, but the threshold to which you can go to challenge, any kind of, issue with leadership or whatever is actually a lot higher than you think. And I know this is, in South Carolina, especially, we're a right to work state, but regardless of whether you work in a right to work state, this is still a fear. But, you know, at the end of the day, if you truly feel that you're being mistreated and you have gone, to try and resolve that, and there's no resolution to that, there's no salary that's worth taking that mistreatment. Often those who abuse the power will back away from someone who stands up for themselves while they defend the team. But at the end of the day, if you have to step away from that place, cool, do it. Leave. Like, there's no, you could have the best protocols around, or you could have the best partners around. You could have, the best immediate supervisor around. But if there's toxicity, if there's problems that are not being addressed and they're actually being perpetuated, and it's negatively affecting you and those around you, it's okay to leave.
Or if something is happening that prevents you from being able to effectively do your job, it also kind of comes down to liability. Now, no, I'm not advocating practicing liability based medicine. You should be
God,
doing,
no.
no, evidence based medicine. I mean, like, if you feel like something is actively going on that is going to hinder your ability to provide the best patient care, don't be part of that. I've had it to where, I've called for supervisor help requiring RSI, and it's like, said supervisor has a reputation of not, RSIing, even if the patient literally meets like every checkbox criteria. If I'm calling for help, I need help because the patient needs help. And if it starts turning into, not even a supervisor, but, another provider, another unit, anything that turns into a hindrance that could potentially lead to bad patient outcome, like, I don't want that liability.
And even, I mean, in any context where you have, and I'm saying supervisor just as a very generic term, anybody who is involved in the chain of command, you know, often the posturing, the, kind of like, I don't know how to perfectly describe it, but like, where when they kind of like bite back at you a little bit, most of that is bluffing. And if you call the bluff, they've got nowhere to go.
Are you talking about like peacocking?
I mean, kind of. I mean, peacocking has has several different connotations, but just, when you have someone who their solution to you challenging them, even if it's, you're legitimately challenging them, their solution is to kind of buck up at you and try and like shove you down. A lot of people will just cower to that because, like, oh, well, it's supervisor, they can fire me. Not to be, rude, but have some respect for yourself. Like, if you feel that you have legitimately been mistreated, then you need to take that up to resolution. And if that means you need to climb above them to get that resolution, cool, because that's you're encouraging rigorous accountability. Everybody should be accountable to the same standard of behavior.
Well, and something that I've noticed, speaking of the right to work, South Carolina is like right to hire, right to fire state. Although that is true, especially with this day and age, a lot of times companies, businesses, services, pick your word for really any industry that you can work in. actually still need to collect, some kind of justified evidence, because in turn, if you were, you know, fired because, they didn't like you, like there's no legitimate reason, you have,
You have some recourse. You have some. There's a process.
I was there's a word for there's a word for it. Like it's unjustified termination, but that's not the
Yeah,
word
yeah,
for
yeah.
it.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Where like wrongful termination is what I've heard.
I was so close. See,
Unjust,
I was
wrongful. It's fine.
unjustified. I was close. Anyways, so a lot of times they still have to get paperwork, but that's where, paper trail, writing up incidents, comes into play. But like Daniel's saying, respect for yourself, try not to instigate and escalate conflict, but it's inevitable.
Well, and in this world of social media that we have now, and I'm not saying that this should be like, oh, your strategy. I'm just saying this is just the reality of it, that if people are mistreated, they're going to broadcast it. They're going to tell people. And most places, can't afford that kind of ripple effect. They can't afford that publicity, especially in public service. It's a very small world. Everybody talks, and social media has just amplified that. So any negative publicity is an even more potent force now than it's ever been. Again, not that this is the stick you use to beat management, over every little inconvenience. We all have seen that person. No one wants to be that. You're a pariah at that point. If you're going to go and complain to God and everybody about every little inconvenience of your job, no one wants to work around that. But the point is, we live in a world now where abuse can't hide. And, there's ups and downs to the quote just culture movement, but on the whole, that has really taken away a lot of the abuse of power, or the I should say, it has taken away the effectiveness of the abuse of power and making it harder for abusive leaders to hide.
Well, and speaking of, public service being a small world and everyone talks, something that I frequently tell new students, reputation follows. Now, I'm not saying that, we should spread gossip. I mean, it happens. It really needs to be slowed down to a stop. But in general, professional reputation follows people. And that's not just true in EMS. I mean, that's true in even the business world. I mean, pick an industry, it happens. Whether it's, let's say you're a chef, it's going to get around no matter where you work. If you're a good chef, a bad chef, if you treat, the servers well, if you don't, servers, if they, if you do some kind of tip pool or give, busboys tips, it's kind of the same thing within the field. Yes, you should gather your own information when meeting people. Don't just automatically assume that they are what their reputation is. But there does come a point where in this small world and everyone talks, your good or bad reputation of being a good partner, being a good person, having good patient care, all the rest of it, or if you have a reputation for being the company slut and sleeping with everybody and their mother, unfortunately that gets around, which I know is a slight sidestep, but that's something that everybody needs to keep in mind. If you have the reputation of escalating fights with patients or with coworkers, or being overtly sexual or overtly aggressive, hating female partners, or being a man hater, like that's not good all the way around. And in turn, that's not good image for a service to hire you. You need to think about not just you, everybody should think of the team, but also who you're representing. Taking care of those patients. Now, something else that complicates things, and I mean, it can come from how you were raised, how you are as an adult, but active people pleasing can actually make problems worse. It will lead to validation of poor behavior. And this applies to both management and team members. If you're a team member that actively people pleases and I'm sorry, as I hiccup, if you're an active people pleaser and don't want to talk to your problematic partner, and they're just like running you over, it's hindering the job, like that is a liability. That is not a problem. Like at some point, that people pleaser. Well, I was going to use active shooters as an example, but that seems very bad. Like it, you
A
have
little extreme.
it. I'm sorry. I was trying to think of an example, but like you have the really quiet, person that just gets run over. They're people pleasing. They're putting their emotions or opinions aside. They're cramming it down. At some point, that's going to hit a boiling point.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sorry if I got dark there for a second. I was trying to think of a better example. But I mean, it comes to a boiling point where maybe then it goes from you didn't even say anything, but like your tone set this person off and they just like absolutely have like a volcanic eruption of anger. It's not going to do well. And if you're a partner who's ignoring your partner's bad behavior or just letting it slide, they're going to keep doing it. It's going to keep multiplying. But same with management. If you're a people pleaser who, you're in management, or supervisor, pick a word, just somewhere on the ladder, who's trying
somewhere north of the bottom of the ladder.
Yes. Who is trying to please literally everybody in every single way, and you're trying to deal with a conflict. If you're going to, you said peacocking wasn't a good, but like if you're going to like,
you're posturing.
If you're going to posture up and be like, oh, this behavior is not acceptable, I'll take care of your problem, but then go to the other provider and be like, well, this isn't so good, so let's not do it again, but like you're doing a good job. Like maybe let's just try and smooth this over. Like all you're doing is encouraging that behavior because they know they're going to get away with it.
Yeah, it's like we said, it's validating that behavior because you're showing that it's acceptable. And it's easy for someone to come back with, well, but everybody, I let everybody get along, and well, let's relate it back to parenting. And again, maybe we're gonna hurt some feelings with this, but when you avoid conflict with your children, you are going to raise children that act in the absence of consequences. And that's not what the real world is. And so you're going to have total and utter fucking chaos. And whereas with your children, and again, there's a huge difference between abuse, whether physical, psychological, whatever, and actual good parenting. There's a massive difference, and there's no need to delve into that specifically right now. But the point is, if you look at families with multiple kids where the parents do toe a consistent, that being the key word, a consistent expectation, and they discipline consistently and fairly across the board, okay, those children in that moment may not like it. They may not like the fact that they have expectations put on them. But guess what? They grow up to be healthy, functional adults who can forge good relationships and can be effective people in the world. The ones who are not taught that their actions have consequences will continue to just act like little sons bitches and continue to cause problems for everyone in their lives. And so you're actually doing a disservice to your people by not being confrontational. Even if it means that you are the one who's perceiving something wrong, you still need to be taking that first step to sit down and say, hey, here's the way I see things. We need to talk about this and get squared away because this is kind of a problem and we don't need this kind of conflict.
I know we've talked about a lot, and we have a couple other like little tidbits, but the biggest thing is conflict is messy. It's inevitable. It's hard. I mean, you're never going to get away with it, even if
away from it, not with it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you for mentioning that.
You're never going to get away with it. Watch me.
No. Sorry, away from it. Like, even if you feel like you deal with conflict relatively well in the business field, you're, like he's talking about, you're going to have conflict at some point, whether it's in a relationship, boyfriend, girlfriend, marriage, whatever, children. I mean, we have it with friends. I mean, it just can start as simple as, a difference of opinion or disagreement. But part of growing for us in EMS as an industry is learning how to maturely lean into that difficult conflict, difficult situation, rather than avoiding it.
I believe there's a I've heard the story before, but then, I heard it on a Facebook reel somewhere. Someone was talking about the difference between cows and buffaloes. So, and I promise there's a point to this. It'll make sense. We all are generally aware that animals as a whole, they can sense bad weather coming. They sense when trouble is coming, when there's problems.
So
What?
can my joints. My joints can feel when rain's coming.
But especially cows and buffalo are very hyper aware of bad weather. And so when when you're in the part of the country where this is relevant, where when there's a blizzard coming or just a major storm is moving in, the cows will try to outrun the storm. They will run away from it and try. Basically, they're living in denial, saying, "Nope, nope, don't want it, don't need it. I'm going to get away from it as fast as I can." Well, the storm still catches up with them. They're wore out. They're tired. They get fucked up. Whatever. And they end up spending more time in the storm as they're trying to run away from it. Whereas the buffalo, they sense the storm coming, they lean towards it, they move towards it and walk through it. So between the motion of the storm and them moving against it, they actually spend the least time in the storm. It's hard in the short term, but it actually benefits them in the long run. And the easiest, to sum this up in 5 words, Jordan Peterson did it wasn't a conference. He was a guest speaker and was talking about conflict in general and people being agreeable, disagreeable, managing conflict. And he said, conflict delayed is conflict multiplied. So you may think that you're doing a good job by avoiding conflict, either as a supervisor or as a brand new EMT or as a brand new paramedic or wherever you are. But in reality, the more you avoid the conflict, you're actually going to make it so that the conflict is going to get worse and it's going to reach a boiling point that's going to be exponentially harder than it needed to be.
So, I guess as we're kind of wrapping everything up, conflict resolution is a part of everyday life for all of us. Like we said, children, coworkers, family life, siblings. Oh Lord, siblings. But
Motherfuckers.
It just no.
There's no amount of good parenting that can necessarily prevent siblings from hating each other.
Oh no, and I mean
it depends on what it is.
Different points in life, different situations. But by learning to embrace it and navigate it effectively, we're gonna be open to so many more opportunities and possibilities in life than if we buried our heads in the sand. I mean, it's ostriches, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That like when they get scared or like just like head first down in the sand, like
head down, ass up.
That could solve a whole other problem. But in the aspect of conflict, don't be an ostrich. Don't be an ostrich, be a buffalo.
Yep. If you lean into the conflict, not for the purpose of causing chaos, but for bringing about a resolution that is healthy for everybody, sometimes means you're wrong, that's going to do so much more good than just trying to avoid the problems or being passive, what have you.
Okay, my ADD self, after when you made that comment, someone should totally make a song about like EMS settling conflict by, head down, ass up, don't be an like.
Oh my God.
Someone totally has to make that song, record it, and send it to us, and we'll share. It would be such a funny song. Like, you know how they make alphabet songs for kids learn the alphabet? Like, we need to have, like, a conflict resolution song that talks about...
Sesame Street gets fucked up.
Sorry, continue.
So, anyway, you need to be able to laugh a little bit about conflict. You don't necessarily need to enjoy it, but realize that sometimes you need to engage in it to avoid more of it. So... if you found value, if you learned something today, if you were challenged, if you were offended, any of the above, please share it with your friends, leave us a review, just help spread the word, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.
The Paramedic AF show is property of the EMS 2.0 project. The beliefs, opinions, and practices discussed in the show are our own and do not represent our respective employers. Please follow your local protocols, policies, and procedures at all times. All listeners are encouraged to research and self-educate regarding all content represented in this show. For more information regarding EMS 2.0, please visit our Facebook page for our website and social media links. Thank you for your continued support, and we look forward to you joining us next time.